Hello and welcome. Today's video is going to be a bit different than what you're used to seeing on this channel. This is an FSX video, and the purpose of this video is, well, I'm going to share my knowledge of low-level wind shear, specifically microbursts and the escape maneuver. Today I'm flying the PMDG 737NG. I'm using FSX, and the scenery I'm using is the Flightbeam's Washington Dulles Airport. The purpose of today's video is to, well, if you don't know what wind shear is, well, there are a lot of excellent sources online that you can find that will teach you all there is to know about wind shear, the different types of wind shear, etc. I'm going to be touching briefly on it, and but the main purpose of this video is to show you the escape maneuver. I must point out that I am a sim enthusiast. I am not a professional airline pilot whatsoever. I have no experience in the real world, and I have never experienced wind shear in the real world. However, I will show you my knowledge based on, or I'll share with you my knowledge based on my research and the documents that I have on the subject. So first of all, what is wind shear? Well, wind shear is defined as a change of wind speed and or direction over a short distance along a flight path. And what causes wind shear? Well, there are many different things that can cause wind shear, like terrain, mountains or buildings can cause what's called, I think it's mechanical wind shear. Thunderstorms, and wind shear comes from those whenever the rain or hail gets too heavy to be sustained in the atmosphere by the same warm, moist air that rises, that causes the cumulonimbus clouds and further develops into a thunderstorm. When the rain or hail in that becomes too heavy to be held up by the rising air, it will fall back to the earth and will bring air rushing down with it. And also another cause of wind shear is a phenomenon known as virga. It follows the same principle as a thunderstorm, except that the rain evaporates before it reaches the ground. Now, how do you avoid wind shear? Well, the first step to avoiding wind shear is to know the clues and tell when wind shear might be present. Wind shear is present in, as I said before, thunderstorm activity, when virga. You can also suspect wind shear from pilot reports via low-level wind shear alerting system, which is it's a ground-based system that is located on or in the vicinity of airports. And the way that works is they have different points along the airport field where they put these stations, and what they do is they compare wind reading. So for example, if there's let's say there's 5 of these stations here at Dulles. What it does is it compares the reading between all 5 of them, and if one or maybe 1 or 2 of them differ beyond a certain parameter, then it gives off an alert to the controllers that there's possibly wind shear at that area. Also, we can avoid wind shear by using the weather radar, which I'm going to demonstrate in this video also. And it's a predicted wind shear system. If you need more, as I said before, if you need more information on wind shear and the types of wind shear, I suggest you check various videos on YouTube and do some searches on Google. You'll find some excellent articles that will go further in depth than what I will do. The 2 types of wind shear that I know about are the ones with a rapidly changing wind speed and or direction, and that's associated with usually with terrain, and the microburst, which is the type of wind shear that I'm going to focus on today. Microbursts are the type of wind shear that's usually associated with thunderstorms and virga. And to get an idea of what I'm talking about in relation to microbursts, picture yourself standing on a level surface, a smooth level surface, holding a cup of water. Let's say that the water is the wind, and now if you hold the cup out directly in front of you and start to pour the water out onto the ground, the water comes down in one stream, and we'll call that one stream the downdraft. Then when the water hits the ground, it spreads out, and let's say it spreads out evenly right around all 360 degrees. It spreads out across the ground. Now the water that flows in towards you, we'll call that the headwind, and the water that flows directly away from you, we'll call that the tailwind, and the water that flows off to the side of the downdraft, we'll call that the crosswind. And that's basically how a microburst works. It's a rush of air that comes down in that column. That downdraft hits the ground and it spreads out in all different directions. Now, how do you recognize that that you have entered a microburst? Well, it depends on where the microburst occurs. If it occurs behind you, then you will notice a rapid decrease. You'll notice a rapid decrease in indicated airspeed, and an almost equally rapid increase in ground speed if your aircraft has a ground speed reading. In this plane we do. And if it's on approach, you'll notice an increase in the rate of descent, and that is caused by the loss of lift associated with the loss of indicated airspeed. Because face it, if you have a loss of indicated airspeed, that means you have a loss of the amount of wind that's flowing over the wing, and naturally you'll have less lift. If you are taking off, the same symptoms would apply, except that the rate of climb would be reduced, and it may even turn into a descent if you're not careful. If the microburst occurs to your left or your right side, then not much will happen, except that you'll get a strong crosswind and you'll get pushed off to the left or the right side. And finally, the classic example of a microburst you always hear about is when it occurs in front of you. Now, what will happen is, if you're on approach to landing, the first thing you'll get is an increase in airspeed. And with that comes, naturally, an increase in lift, which if the pilot isn't aware of what is happening, he'll try to correct for it by lowering the nose and reducing the engine power, because that increase in lift causes him to get above the glide path, and then as he flies into the increased headwind, he'll get into the downdraft. Now when he gets into the downdraft, now remember, this downdraft is rushing down towards the ground, but as he gets into the downdraft, he already has the power all the way back. The nose is down, trying to lose the height that he gained. So the aircraft is already in a low power situation, trying to descend, and it gets pushed down further by the downdraft. So obviously you can see where that would go. It could turn out to be pretty bad. And as he goes through the downdraft, as he passes the downdraft, he gets into the tailwind, and of course, because he lost the headwind from before, his airspeed is already low. You get into the tailwind, your airspeed gets even lower, and your aircraft would basically stall. It would stall, and it would stall. So all this is an example of what would happen if you approach the landing. On departure, specifically the takeoff mode, if the microburst occurs behind you, you'll notice a very slow buildup of indicated airspeed combined with a fast buildup of ground speed, as the tailwind would push you down the runway. Now this is dangerous for obvious reasons, because if it's not recognized early enough and you try to continue to take off, you could run out of runway before you get to VR. Or if you were to try and stop under a main runway, you could be traveling too fast and end up off the end of the runway. If the microburst occurs in front of you on takeoff, the indicated airspeed would show an increase, of course. Essentially increasing faster than your ground speed. So if you see a rapid jump in airspeed and your ground speed isn't showing that same jump, then obviously you have an increase in headwind. And again, if you're not aware of what is happening, you'll get to VR faster when you pull back, and the plane will fly because it has an increased, it's receiving more wind over the wings, so it will fly. You get to rotation speed, you pull back and you think for yourself, I got to VR pretty quick, okay, let's get flying. But wrong. And you find yourself into the downdraft, you lost the headwind, and you could potentially end up even below the minimum speed at which you're safe to fly, and you could, you know, again stall and combine that with a downdraft, pushing the aircraft down. Again, you can see where that would go. If a microburst occurs to your left or your right during takeoff, then that also has its challenges. If it occurs while you just started the takeoff roll, while your indicator airspeed is still very low, let's say too low for the rudder to have any effect, then the wind would push the vertical stabilizer one way and swing the nose of the aircraft the other way, and you might go off the edge of the runway without any control, and nose wheel steering wouldn't be able to help you. Now if you're well into the takeoff, and if you're well into the takeoff roll, the rudder is picking up enough airflow over it, it's effective, everything is nice, and you get the crosswind, the strong crosswind from a microburst from your left or your right. Depending on how strong it is, you might be able to fly out of it. You might be able to keep the aircraft on the runway, maybe not on the center line, but you might be able to keep it on the runway long enough to get off the ground. If, however, it is a very strong crosswind, then you might not be able to even keep it on the runway no matter what you do, and you may go off the edge before you get airborne. Another thing to look out for is as you get the crosswind during takeoff, let's say from the left side, then excuse me, then that wind would get under the left wing and will try to lift that wing up, and you run the risk of striking the right wing on the ground if you're not careful. So if you've managed to stick around for this long, then you should realize that the first and most effective way to avoid a wind shear and not getting into one of these situations is to be aware and avoid. Look for the signs, understand the effects, and know how the aircraft will respond. Know what to do, know what not to do if you find yourself caught in a microburst. And if you use Activesky Next by Hifisim, then you know that this is a real virtual danger. Now, as no other weather program that I know of, and neither does FSX on its own, is able to simulate microbursts. So I'm going to demonstrate the escape maneuvers as outlined by Boeing's procedures for the 737 NG. And but before we get going to that, we're going to discuss the equipment. Now, if you own the PMDG 737 or the 777 along with Activesky Next, then you have the ability to produce a microburst on your own with Activesky Next and detect the microburst with the PMDG aircraft. PMDG aircraft simulates the Collins weather radar system. And it's only on the 737 and the 777, and this system comes with what's known as a predictive wind shear system. Now, the way I understand the predictive wind shear system to work is that when the aircraft is at 1200 feet above the ground or below, 1200 feet or below above the ground. The predictive wind shear system works with a weather radar, and instead of the weather radar scanning from left to right as it normally does, it starts to scan in a figure 8 pattern turned on its side. So it sweeps from top left to bottom right, to top right to bottom left, and back to top left, and it repeats. Now as the radar emits the microwaves and it receives any reflected signals that may come from water droplets in the air, this is analyzed by the PWS, or predictive wind shear system, using some sort of Doppler algorithm, and determines based on the movement of the water droplets if wind shear is present. It doesn't work in totally dry atmospheric conditions. It may work on dust particles, however, I've read that this may cause false indications of wind shear, which is why it's always good to confirm if there are any pilot reports or look for any other signs of wind shear. One thing I should mention is that the weather radar does not have to be on for the PWS to detect wind shear. If the radar is off and the aircraft is below 1200 feet AGL, if wind shear is detected, it switches on the weather radar and displays the wind shear information automatically. Now, how do you know if the PWS has detected wind shear? Well, first, there are two wind shear alerts in most Boeing aircraft. The first alert comes from the PWS system in the form of an oral alert that goes something like monitor radar display, as well as a visual indication on the nav display that has red markings which kind of look like a fingerprint, I guess you'd call it, that shows the location where the wind shear was detected. And I can demonstrate that to you right now by turning on the weather radar and pressing the test button. This is test button. Oh, that's not. This is test button.
Monitor radar display. Go around. Wind shear ahead.
And here's the fingerprint
Wind
that I was
shear
talking
ahead.
about.
Wind shear ahead.
Right, so that's the test, and that's what it looks like. Now, as you get closer to the wind shear symbol, if at a certain point it's still detected by the PWS, you'll receive an oral go around wind shear ahead. At which time, if you suspect this is not a false alert, you execute a normal go around and monitor your instruments carefully for any indication that you may have penetrated the shear. And by the way, this is called a predictive wind shear alert. The second type of alert is called a reactive wind shear alert, and this type of alert comes from the aircraft GPWS and is triggered when certain parameters are met, including or exceeded, including the indicated airspeed. I think the indicated airspeed, the vertical speed, and I think if there's a certain amount of change in the wind speed and direction as detected by the inertial system here. And when that's detected, you'll get a two-toned oral siren, as well as an oral wind shear, wind shear, wind shear. And it usually gives you visual cues on the nav display, and I think the PFD also. At which time you must use the wind shear escape maneuver and follow the flight director commands if you are flying manually. If you are on the ground and let's say you're taxiing and wind shear is detected by the PWS, then it is recommended that you delay the takeoff for no less than 10 minutes after the wind shear was last detected, if in your judgment as captain that it will be in your flight path. Now, airline policies will differ a bit here, but in case you determine that you can climb away from the shear safely, or you haven't received a PWS alert, but based on pilot reports, wind shear is suspected to be around, Boeing has outlined a procedure for this as well. And it's, if I read, you can find this information in the PMDG manual in the QRH, and It says prior to V1 you reject the takeoff, and if you're after V1 you perform the windshear escape maneuver. It's also worth noting here that if windshear is occurred during the takeoff roll, prior to V1 there may not be sufficient runway remaining to stop if any rejected takeoff is initiated at V1. At VR, you rotate at a normal rate towards 15 degrees pitch attitude, keeping in mind that the tail strike limit for the 800 series of the 737 is about 11.5 degrees. So you rotate to that, and once the aircraft gets airborne, you aim for 15 degrees pitch. And then once you're airborne, you do the windshear escape maneuver. If windshear is encountered near VR and the airspeed suddenly decreases, there may not be enough runway left to accelerate back to VR. So if there is insufficient runway left to stop, then you initiate a normal rotation at least 2,000 feet before the end of the runway, even if your airspeed is low. Higher than normal attitudes may be required to lift off the remaining runway, and you ensure maximum thrust is set. It also says if you get a go-around windshear ahead oral alert, you perform a windshear escape maneuver, or at pilot's discretion perform a normal go-around. And of course you monitor your instruments carefully. Now you as a pilot can also see windshear before waiting for the suppose, let's say for example, the system doesn't detect any windshear, then you as a pilot have some parameters to go by here to suspect, to see if you're encountering windshear. And it states that in steady state flight conditions below 1000 AGL, if any of the following is in excess, if you have more than 15 knots indicated airspeed change, more than 500 feet per minute vertical speed, rate of change, a change in pitch attitude of more than 5 degrees, or 1 dot displacement from glide slope or more, or any unusual thrusting position for a significant period of time, then you're probably experiencing windshear. Now the windshear escape maneuver, if you're in manual flight, if you want to do it manually, you disconnect the autopilot, press either toggle switch, aggressively apply maximum thrust, disconnect the auto throttle. Simultaneously roll wings level to get maximum lift, and rotate towards an initial pitch altitude of 15 degrees. Retract the speed brakes, follow the flight director toga guidance if it's available. And if you're going to stay on the autopilot, you press either toggle switch again, verify toga mode is enunciated on the FMA, the flight mode annunciator, this is up here. Verify the thrust advances to go around, retract the speed brakes, and you monitor the system performance. Now it's very important that you do not change the flap or gear configuration until the windshear is no longer a factor. This is very important. I've tried to find out the reason why, but as far as I could come up with, the reasons range from a landing gear. Let's say you're on approach and you initiate a windshear escape, or even takeoff. A landing gear in transit usually causes more drag than a gear that's already down and locked. In the event of terrain contact, a landing gear down might cushion the impact to even save the aircraft if the ground contact isn't too hard. And being in landing flaps and retracting the gear may cause a configuration warning, which can be distracting and increases stress in the cockpit. Also, retracting the flaps during a windshear escape maneuver would cause a loss in performance for the escape. And I even saw one thing where someone suggested that, what about extending the flaps to gain more performance? Well, you would gain a performance in that, but you also run the risk of selecting the wrong configuration. For some strange reason, in the high stress environment, you might end up retracting the flaps and you know, instead of extending it. Also, to get maximum performance out of the aircraft, you could pull the aircraft back and until you get the intermittent stick shaker. Not a continuous stick shaker, but you pull it back enough, you pull the yacht back, get the stick shaker, release it, pull it back again, get stick shaker, release it, stick shaker goes away, you pull it back again, stick shaker comes back, and they do something like that. I'm using FS2 Crew, which I guess he will help me out. It isn't designed for Windshear. I don't think you can detect Windshear, but hey, I'll use it to the extent that's possible. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to taxi onto the runway, and once I'm lined up, I'm going to bring up Activesky Next, and I'm going to create a Windshear event using the debug option. What that does is it creates a Windshear, a microburst that's 3 miles directly in front of the aircraft. On takeoff here, we might not experience the Windshear, we might climb out above it, but if we do, I'll try to demonstrate the escape maneuver. So they suggest for takeoff, let me just get my notes here, give me a second. Right, so for takeoff, use maximum thrust instead of reduced thrust, which we have that selected there. For optimum takeoff performance, use flaps 5, 10, or 15 unless limited by unless limited by obstacle clearance or climb gradient. Use the longest suitable runway provided it is clear of areas of known wind shear. And what that means is, let's say we have an 11,000 foot runway here and there's wind shear in that area, but on the other side of the field we have a 7,000 or 8,000 foot runway that is not experiencing wind shear. Obviously we wouldn't take the 11,000 foot runway, we'd take the shorter 7,000 foot one because that is not in wind shear. It also says that we consider using increased VR speed. Speed not to exceed VR plus 20 knots to get better stall margin and still meets the takeoff performance requirements. If wind shear is encountered at or below the actual VR, which is what we have here, 120 knots, we don't attempt to accelerate to the increased VR, but we rotate without hesitation. Be alert for any airspeed fluctuations during takeoff and initial climb, and some fluctuations may be the first indication of wind shear. Alright, so I do have crash detection turned off, because keep in mind we may not be able to escape from the shear when ground contact may occur, so I wouldn't want that to. Although if we do make ground contact, it would basically end the video there, and we'd probably move on to the next video. But I do have crash detection turned off because these complex simulation of aircraft do get a bit buggy when they have to be reloaded incorrectly, especially after a crash. So I'll turn on track IR here, and we'll let FS2 crew know that we're ready. So what we're going to do, we're going to take off, apply maximum thrust, take off with flap 50, we rotate normally and we monitor. Well, I'm going to do the wind shear escape. Even if we don't experience wind shear, we're going to do it. Alright, so we're clear on the approach. Runway entry procedure. Check.
Ready to go.
Approaching 0-1 center.
Sorry about my frame rates here. I probably should have used a default scenery, but anyways.
On runway 0-1 center.
And that's confirmed. Stop the aircraft and go into Activesky. go to the Tools, View Debug window, and create Microburst. And what this does, it will create a microburst directly in front of us, 3 miles from our position. Now I thought the PWS would be detected. Let me just see. Maybe it doesn't work if we're on the ground, but we'll see. Alright, and there we go. Takeoff.
Check.
Advanced throttles to 40%. Wait for it to stabilize.
Windshear ahead. Windshear ahead.
And there it is.
Thrust set. 80 knots.
Checked.
V1.
Rotate.
Delay rotation and
Positive rate.
and we don't trouble the configuration until we're clear of the shear.
VNAV.
And this is the Windshear escape maneuver. We should be clear of the shear now, so we call gear up, gear up,
Gear up.
select VNAV.
VNAV. Gear up. The lights out.
Select Command A.
1,000 to go. Command A.
And we'll just take over manual control of the speed here. And we'll set up the aircraft for the approach.
Check.
Flaps 5.
Flaps 5.
Flaps 1.
Flaps 1.
Flaps up.
Flaps up.
And we're overshooting the altitude here.
I'm ready for the checklist when you are.
After takeoff checklist.
Engine bleeds. On. Pax. Auto. Landing gear. Up and off. Flaps. Up. No lights. After takeoff checklist. Done.
Okay, I'm gonna set up the aircraft for the approach now. I'm gonna end the video here, but as suspected, I climbed out above the shear, so we didn't experience any wind shear on departure. So I'm gonna set up the aircraft for the approach, and I'm gonna demonstrate a predictive wind shear escape maneuver. Alright, see you in the next one.